Okay guys, our today's topic is about, was Pope a poet or is Pope a poet? So I am going to start this topic to telling you that there are two groups. One of them is favor of the Pope as a poet and the other one is not. So this is a controversy that has throughout been present and still exists. To some critics, he is one of the master poets, very close to Shakespeare and Milton, while others are of the view that Pope is primarily a satirist who adopted poetry as a means of satire and so he lacks the essential qualities of a great poet. Okay, two groups. Critics who do not regard Pope as a poet bring two allegations against his poetry. First is that his ideas are not poetic. Ideas are not poetic. According to them, ideas must be poetic ideas. If you are not dealing in the way of poetry through your ideas, it means that you are not a great poet. Okay. Second is that whatever he writes is prose in verse. They believe poetry to be a different genre from prose, and to them mere versification is not poetry. It doesn't mean that you are writing in verses, you are writing a poetry. No, poetry is something else. As William Wordsworth defined it, poetry is the spontaneous flow of thoughts. If you are not writing in flow of thought, though you are writing in verses, it means you are not writing a good poetry. If you are using your intellectual, it means according to these poets, according to these critics who say that his ideas are not poetic, actually they want to say that he is not using emotions, passions in his poetry. So he is just using intellectualism. Okay, so is not poetry unless ideas are not poetic. Walton, in this regard, say that his poetry is didactic, moral, and satirical, hence not a poet. So, if you're writing a didactical poetry, if you are writing moral poetry, to according to some critics, that this is not a poetry, this is prose, but you're writing in verse, poetic prose. It will be a poetic prose. Okay, so what does Walton say in this regard? He said that his poetry is didactic, moral, satirical, hence not a poet. Pope lacks the sublime and the pathetic elements. Moral teaching, didacticism, and satire may be the function of a satirist, a preacher, but not of a poet. So, as I have already told you that if you are preaching someone through your verses, it doesn't mean that you are writing a poetry. It means that you are writing prose but in verse. You are writing a poetic prose. To Wordsworth and Coleridge, Pope is the founder of the mechanical school of poetry. Okay, what does Wordsworth and Coleridge say? They say that Pope is not a poet, but he found a mechanical school of poetry. Patterson, Patterson is another critic. Stephen, Pattison, Stephen. So there are other critics and Arnold all agree on the point that his poetry is only rhymed prose and he is not an actual poet. So the name that I have taken here, once again I am going to write these names on your screen if you can watch the screen. So they are Wordsworth, Coleridge and company. Okay, I am not going to write the name of all these writers because the shortage of time. So Wordsworth is a romantic poet, Coleridge as well, and other his their company is also romantic poets. It means the romantic were of the view that Alexander Pope is not a true poet. So why were they against him? I am going to tell you, I am going to explain in a few moments. Okay, so conversely, the second group There are still greater critics who admire him as a great poet. Dr. Johnson, for example, is of the view that, so here is the true quotation of Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson says, if Pope is not a poet, where is poetry to be found? Okay, if he is not a good poet, so what do you mean by poetry? He is replying the allegations of those poets who allegated that Pope was not a correct poet, or not a pure poet, or not a perfect poet, or not a true poet. Okay, Dr. Johnson and say Pope was a and other critic who is very great critic is Hazlitt. So Hazlitt says Pope was a wit, a critic, and a man of sense. So a poet. He says that a poet can use wit, a poet can be a critic, and he is a man of sense. So he is a true poet. All these qualities are very necessary for a poet to describe, to express. Sometimes Chaucer was even not writing in according to the passions. He was not passionate, he was not giving the senses, he was not giving emotions, but he was describing, he was just painting the picture of his own age. So this work is once again being done by Alexander Pope, but the romantic says that he is not a true poet. Okay, so these were some major critics who were of the view that Pope is a great poet. Dr. Johnson is one of them, Hazlitt is the other one. Okay, so Sainsbury and other you can say a critic, Sainsbury, he says that Pope has a chief place as a poet. He may not be a transcendent poet, a mean perfect poet, but he is still a poet because his aim was to be a poet of correctness and to have perfection of style. So he says that he perfected the style of poetry, therefore he is a good poet. Okay, he is a great artist of his time and brings new harmony to English poetry. And Byron pays him to greatest tribute. Another critic, Byron, he says that he is the greatest poet whose reputation will not be ended up even in the coming age. Okay, he says that he is a poet for all ages, as Shakespeare and Chaucer are regarded as the poets of all ages. So Byron also regarded Alexander Pope as the poet of all ages. To him, his poetry is a book of life. He says that his poetry is a book of life, and such a poet is born once in 1,000 years. So, according to him, he is very great poet. From above cited opinions that I have given to you, both the groups becomes very difficult for us to decide who is actually right. It is a Gordian knot which demands a throughout security of the questions. Okay, so the allegations of the critics who say that he is not a true poet as well acceptable, and the critics who say that he was a great poet, they are also right. Why they are both of them are right? Okay, I'm going to describe this. Listen to me carefully. Any poetry is consisted of two things. Poetry consisted of two things. Okay, there must be two things in a poetry. So number one is matter, number two is manner. Okay, so what is matter? Matter means style, and sorry, matter means subject or theme of poetry or of something, while manner means style. Okay, are techniques in which poet communicates his thoughts. The classics are mainly interested in the manner. So classics are interested in the manner, while romantics are interested in matters. Okay, so classics in manner, it means classics are bound with rules and regulations, while romantics like fine excesses in poetry. Pope, being a new classical writer, is more concerned with the manner and less with the spirit. So He focused on the manners of writing his poetry. Uh, therefore, romantics called him not a true poet because he was focusing only on the pattern in which he was writing, not on the subject matters or themes that were very necessary for him to write. So, therefore, they called him not a true poet. Okay. So it is a charge on him that his poetry lacks the flight of imagination, while the reason is that he is a satirist, and a satirist is bound to evaluate the situation of his age in a very truthful manner. So if he is not a true poet, so Chaucer will also not be a true poet because he was also describing his age with very detail, with every detail. Even he was describing the pilgrimage pilgrims. Even he was telling us about the style, about the style of their dresses, what they were riding, each and everything he was telling us through a true picture. So if Pope is not a poet, so Chaucer will also not be a poet because he was not dealing with imagination, or you can say passion, feelings. So he was a true poet. If he is called the father of poetry, so why Pope is not called as a true poet? Okay, we can say that in his poetry, wit and reason dominate, not spirit, not emotions, not anything else regarding to emotions, passions, feelings. But in his poetry, the dominant thing is reason, intellectualism. Okay. Moreover, he is a classical poet, so therefore he does not possesses the high imagination of a romantic poet. That is why if we approach him as a romantic critic, of course he will fall short of a poet. So is it clear why romantics were not calling him a true poet? But if we evaluate him in view of his aim he wants to achieve through his poetry, he is a great poet. He is a realistic with regard to his age, while the ideas of romantic poets have nothing to do with real life. Okay, so according to the theory of the purposeful art, Pope is a great poet and he exercised very great influence on the 18th century poets. Another charge leveled against Pope's poetry is that his poetry lacks original or creative stuff. In The Rape of the Lock, most of the ideas are commonplace, but it does not make Pope as an inferior poet. His greatness is that he recreated and reconstructed old and familiar ideas in a such way that they look new. In this respect, he is comparable with Chaucer, Milton, and Shakespeare, who also retreated the old stories to make them look new. So there is a lot of creativity in pop with regard to the treatment of scheme and ideas and theme. So a critic Dennis says that pop is not dull because common sentiments have been dressed up in finer clothes. The creative power surpasses that of the romantic critics. It may not be difficult to define Pope's status as a poet if we accept and understand that Pope has his own conception of poetry and that his poetry is the product of his age. These considerations determine the line of his poetry. His poetic conception is as a great mark. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that if we look at uh, the situations, the conditions of the age of the Pope, and the style in which poetry was being written. So, Pope is a great master of the poetry of his own age. Therefore, we can say that he is a good poet, he is a true poet because he gives us the realistic picture of the era in which he was living. While if you take into account the allegations of the you can say romantic poets, so they will be of low value because they don't believe with the realistic picture of the society. They didn't give us the true picture of the society. So Pope he was a poet of reason, and therefore his poetry can only be appreciated as the product of reason and intellect. Primarily, he was not a poet of inspiration and imagination, and therefore, style and pattern were very important for him. His ideas may not be deep or new, but the presentation of those ideas is very lucid, beautiful, and convincing. With the help of his style, he paints picture in words and is called image making poet. His thoughts may be old, conventional, and borrowed by others, but his workmanship is unique. What he lacks in emotions is compensated by intellectual clearness and lucid expression. So it would be incorrect to say that he was not a poet at all. So thank you, guys. Now I am going to give you